In your first kit, you should receive a shelter with clamp for each location, if ordered, a pad folio containing the correct number of thermal desorption tubes with nuts on both ends, inside a unique aluminum tube holder with incorporated wrenches, a diffusive sampling cap for each sample tube, a pre-populated chain of custody, a pair of nitrile gloves, and a return shipping box with shipping label. Until you are ready to deploy the tubes, you should store them in a climate-controlled, solvent-free area. Be sure to allow all thermal desorption tubes to equilibrate with ambient temperature 30 minutes to an hour prior to sample deployment. First, install the shelters in each location in accordance with the EPA 325 method, using the provided clamp approximately 1.5 to 3 meters from the ground. These have been pre-labeled with each of your location numbers as requested when you placed your order using a weather-resistant label. Now, you can put on the nitrile gloves and begin deploying each tube. Tube holders will be labeled by location and placed in the pad folio in sequential order, using the numbering scheme you determined when the order was placed. The first 2 digits represent the sequence of placement, and the second 2 digits of the sample ID represents the sample location. The third 2 digits represent which 14-day sampling group this is. For the first set of samples, this number will be 1. The fourth 2 digits represent the type of sample. SA is a sample, DU is a duplicate, and FB is a field blank. Note: never use stickers, markers, pens, or any other method to mark the actual thermal desorption tubes. This may compromise the sample and void your results. Remove the lid to the shelter. Remove the first tube holder from the pad folio and verify that the second 2 digits match the shelter location. Unscrew the end cap of the tube holder and remove the thermal desorption tube. Inspect the tube to ensure that it is intact, securely capped, and in good condition. Any suspect tubes should not be used. The end that is marked with an X is the end that needs the nut removed to sample. Note: the arrow etched on the tube can also be used as a guide for airflow. Remove the nut on the opposite end that the arrow points to. This only applies to sample and duplicate tubes. Field blanks will not have either end removed. Note: you will only have 2 blanks per complete set of samples. These should be deployed at 2 different quadrants. For example, at 90 degrees and at 270 degrees. You will have 1 duplicate for every 10 samples for each sample set. Using the tube holder, slide the nut through the open end portion of the tube holder and utilize this end as a 9/16 inch wrench. Now use the end cap you unscrewed as a 1/2 inch wrench. Hold the tube holder steady while turning the end cap counterclockwise until loose. It is not necessary to disconnect the 2 pieces. Place the tube open end down in one of the small holes of the shelter. The tube should snap into the clip easily. Firmly place a diffusive sampling cap on the open end of the tube on the underside of the shelter. Store the end nuts inside the tube holder for use after sampling. Reinstall the end cap back on the tube holder and place it back in the pad folio. Tip: you may want to place it in the opposite direction so, at a glance, you know which ones you have already deployed. Continue to use the same method to deploy all tubes marked SA for samples and DU for duplicates. Field blanks should not have either end removed and should be placed in the larger hole in the shelter. Now, reinstall the shelter cap and continue to the next location and repeat steps to deploy all tubes. Record the date and time that all samples were deployed on the chain of custody. These samples should be retrieved in 14 to 16 days at the same approximate time. Now, place the pad folio containing all the empty tube holders with the chain of custody and supplied return shipping box in a climate-controlled, solvent-free area until you are ready to retrieve them and deploy your next set of tubes. Once you are ready to deploy the next set of tubes, you will utilize the same steps as previously shown in this video. But first, you will retrieve the sampled tubes. You should arrive at your first location with both pad folios to retrieve the sampled tubes and deploy your next set. Remove the first empty tube holder and match the second 2 digits to the location. Remove the lid to the shelter. Now remove the diffusive end cap from the sampled tube and place the cap inside the plastic Ziploc bag marked Used Diffusion Caps. Retrieve the nut end from the tube holder and use the tube holder wrench to secure the end nut back on the tube. It is imperative that you securely fasten the nut on the end of the tube, but do not over-tighten. Check that both ends are secure for shipment. Note, you can use the tube manufacturer's etched number on the tube as a guide to reference each tube on the chain of custody. Place the tube inside the tube holder, screw on the end cap, and place it in the pad folio. Tip: you may want to place it in the opposite direction, so at a glance, you know which ones you have already retrieved. For locations having both a sample and a duplicate, both will be analyzed in the same manner. There is no risk of mixing these two types of samples, as long as these tubes with nuts that have been removed get placed back into the aluminum tube holders labeled SA and DU with the correct location. It is imperative that the field blank tube with no nuts removed gets properly placed in the tube holder marked FB for each correct location. Now, you can utilize the same deployment instructions previously shown in this video to deploy the next set of tubes. Remove the nuts marked with an X, place them in the tube holder, and install diffusion end caps. Be sure not to remove the nuts from either end of the field blanks and use the larger hole in the shelter for these. You will now have a pad folio filled with sampled tubes and one filled with empty tube holders. Store the pad folio with the empty tube holders in a climate-controlled, solvent-free area with the supplied return shipping box and the chain of custody you marked with deployment date and times. Complete the chain of custody for the completed samples, including retrieved date and times. List the average ambient temperature and average barometric pressure if known. Be sure to print, sign, and date the bottom of all pages of the chain of custody. Place the chain of custody in the pad folio. Place the pad folio in the shipping box with the return shipping label, seal the box, and tender it to UPS. You will automatically receive new tubes every 2 weeks to continue to swap out for the duration of your sampling. Questions? Contact SGS Galson by phone, email, or IH live chat, and access our extensive library of helpful videos at sgsgalson.com. Thank you.